this is going to be an interactive demo. So I have a software that's up in GitLab that is an example of how to use 4DFLib. So it's a great way to, actually see how to use it because it's all set up so you can use it as a framework for your own project. And it's also an opportunity for us to discuss as we go through it kind of the different aspects at play here. We can talk a little bit about libraries and Gradle and connecting to the database and all those good things. So I'm going to, unlike normal where I had the presentation full screen and I'm going through it, I have some slides here and they're more intended for you, to use as a reference. So I'm going to sometimes use them and sometimes not and flip back and forth. And I'm going to, more importantly, kind of show you the GitHub repositories that you care about, namely the 4DFLib one and the Black Car Service example, and cloning it, using Gradle for it, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to flip back and forth. So getting started here, 4DFLib, like any other JVM based library, is available as a jar. You can actually get a jar file from Maven Central directly, or create one yourself since it's an open source project. But the easier way to do it, and the modern way to do it, is to include it as a dependency and let your build tool kind of worry about that. So the example we're going to be using is Gradle, and I have an example here of how you would set that up in Gradle. But you could also do this for Maven or SBT or Ant or something like that. Now, please, stick with Gradle. That's the definite preferred way to do it. If you're, comfortable in another one like Maven, that's absolutely fine. If you happen to know what SBT is, Scala Build Tool, and use that, that's absolutely fine because I use those as well. But I gave up on Ant a long time ago and I don't have it configured or set up anymore. So please don't use Ant. And you can obviously do this manually, but it's, if you haven't been exposed to using build tools like this is a good opportunity to do so because it's something you're going to want to incorporate in your future. I guarantee. And this isn't even just a Java thing. Builds are something that, while it's different in languages about how they deal with them, this is something that is, relevant for pretty much everything you do in computer science. So something to get used to and something to do. So other examples here, I have SBT in case you use SBT and Maven. The important thing here is you have these three things that you use. You have the group ID, the artifact ID, and the version. These three things give you a specific version of a specific software. And since this is an open source software, it is available, I don't have a link to it, but is available in what's called Maven Central. Since this is interactive, let's just check that out. Maven Central is a repository of binaries that are out there. So if I come up here and I search for 4DFLib, you can see here it is, and it has com.4dflib as the package, 4dflib as the actual application, and then if you click on it, you can see the versions. Now, these are the production versions. There might be other snapshot versions that were made available. We're going to stick with the latest one, which was released in 2 years ago in 2017, and that's 1.3, right? So this one here, and if you click on it, you can actually see here, this is actually really helpful. If you click through here are all the tools and how you would include it using that tool. So that is definitely something that is helpful. It also gives the GitHub page, which is great. I happen to have it up here, but you can get to it that way as well. So Maven Central is a way to distribute binaries. So GitHub is a way to distribute code, right? Maven Central is a way to distribute binaries. So the idea here is that we no longer have to go manually find a jar file and manually stick it in a library folder somewhere and make sure it's on our path. Now it's all centralized. So you're basically going, you're not, but your build tool is going to Maven Central to pull in your library as needed. And the cool part is if there's updates to that library, depending on how explicit you are with the version number, it will get them automatically, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of advantages to doing it that way. We're going to, for this example, stay straight Java. As I mentioned before, 4DFLib runs on the JVM, so you can actually use it anywhere you use the JVM, which is pretty cool. But because you guys have a requirement, as a prereq for this course, in object-oriented programming language, and as far as I know, they still teach that with Java, but even if they don't, what you need to know is object-oriented programming, which this is. I'm going to stick with straight Java. If you want to use it in something else, you can. If you're into Scala or Play Framework, that's another one I use a lot. I have an example for that as well. Although, to be honest, the example for that I haven't updated, so it might be a little out of date. But it still has most of the guts. So if you're into that, I have an example there. But we're going to be using this first one here. All right, so that's the important one for us. And this program, by the way, is just completely made up. It's just to show how things work. And when we get it set up and loaded and we run it the first time, after we see all that work, I'm going to kind of look at the main files so you get a feel for what does what. So prerequisites, what do you need? You need Java. So obviously you need Java 8 or better. If I come in here and I say Java version, I have 1.8. If you have something newer than that, that should be fine. I don't think you're going to run into any issues. You might have to set the actual Java build version differently, but I set it to 1.8 because it's pretty universal. It has lambdas and everything I use in functional style, and I don't really need too much for what we're doing here beyond that. So, that is maybe a little bit of an older version now, but it's still a good, relevant version. So nothing wrong with that. And if you have a newer Java, you should be able to go back down. But you definitely need Java runtime, and you should probably have a JDK as well. I mean, if you're doing Java development, it only makes sense to have a JDK. So you also need Git and Gradle, right? So if I do Git here, I have Git installed and it's on my path. And if I do Gradle, I can type Gradle and there you go. So I have Gradle as well. You will need those tools installed on your machine as well. Another thing you'll need is a database. Now, as we mentioned before, 4DFLib supports Postgres, MySQL, and Hypersonic, or sorry, now it's just HyperSQL, showing my age. You need one of those installed. I highly recommend MySQL just because I'm going to use it in the demo and it's a little bit easier to follow along. But if you like Postgres, for example, and you have that installed, there's absolutely no reason why you can't use it. You're just going to have to take a little bit of a look at how 4DFLib connects. I'm going to show you that file as we go through the demo. And you'll probably have to use a modified version of the connection information to connect to your database. It's really not hard. It's pretty straightforward. So if you've ever connected a database to anything before, I don't expect it to be too much of a challenge. But that said, it is going to deviate more. So if you're in a vacuum and you don't care what database software you use, and you don't have either one installed, or maybe you just don't use them that much, I recommend just sticking with MySQL for this because it's the one that I'll be using in the demo. So you stay true to that. Now, this says that MySQL has no root password. Now, that's not a requirement. This is just this is kind of a prereq, but in the sense that I'm demoing it with a MySQL because my development machine that has no password. So that's how I'm going to be using it. And if yours is set up that way, you don't need to tell 4DFLib about the root password because there isn't one and it defaults to none. That said, you can absolutely have a root password. So if you've installed MySQL already and it has a root password, don't go trying to uninstall it and reinstall it with no password, or you don't even have to change the password to having no password. You can if you want, but you don't have to do that. The newer versions of MySQL actually kind of force you to do a root password when you install, depending on how you install them, and that wasn't the case years ago. So don't feel that you need to change it. I'm going to explicitly show you where you just need to enter the root password in the configuration when you get there. So that's kind of the last piece. But you do need MySQL installed, and ideally it should be on your path. So if I go to MySQL here, because I have no password, I can just put MySQL root and I'm in. Now I'm going to do a show databases here. And I have a bunch of databases in this computer, but notice that I have 24 rows, right? So later we're going to be adding a database, and you'll see that I'll have more than that. So once 4DFLib creates a database, we'll have some more. All right, so now that we've got all that constructed, we can now go ahead looking at actually doing this. So I have a note here about how you actually change the database. I'm going to show that, so I'm going to come back to this in a moment, along with the passwords and the settings and stuff like that. So the first thing we want to do is clone this project. So let's first look at the project. If you go to GitHub and you just search for 4DFLib, you will see that at least these three repositories will come up. The first one here, I've already broken it out, is actual 4DFLib library, and there's kind of getting started stuff here in what it is, and feel free to read through that, but I wouldn't worry about following this specific documentation, because this video is going to be specifically for you using this example. So this is the library itself, and we'll come back to that to reference it as we need to. And this is the example that we're going to actually clone to use the library. Remember, the library itself is going to be brought in from Maven Central as a dependency by this this example. So you don't need to actually do anything with the library. You just need to know of its existence, and if you want to read through the documentation or look at the classes, you can. What you really need is this. You need the BCS example, which is what we are going to be using to do this. So what you're going to do is just come over here and clone or download, or grab that link that I had in the previous slide. And now I'm going to git clone, and I'm going to, whoops, throw this in. I did the wrong paste. I go back and forth between Linux and Mac, and on Linux I need Control Shift paste to get it into the terminal, and on Mac I just need Command paste. So there we are. So we're going to clone, and that's pretty straightforward. If I take my caps lock off, we can see now that I have a new directory here. Now, I didn't really talk about this beforehand, but make sure that you clone to a directory that's kind of the parent that you want to use. So you can see here that I have like project courses, our course number, and then I created a folder within there for everything I do that has to do with 4DFLib. Right? Now in there I cloned it. Now I have this new directory here, which actually contains the project. So this this one here is actually my project home directory, right? So when I refer to the project home and I tell you to zip something, obviously this is the example, not your project, but if I back up and I make a directory for, say, I'll call it my project, please don't call yours my project, call it something a little bit more intelligible than that, because I'll have 8 million my projects. If I tell you to zip your project and send it to me, what I'm referring to is this, right? I can't remember if it's my project. I think it's the opposite, but let me just fail and then I'll know for sure. Zip. Yeah, I think this is reverse. So we'll call it myproject.zip, and my project folder is what I want to zip. And there you go. So there was nothing in it. It's an empty folder, but this file right here is what I would want you to send me when you submit your project, of course, with all the information in it, not just an empty folder. But when I refer to your project home, I'm referring to these folders, right? This is the examples project home. This would be my hypothetical projects home, etc. So let's go into the example. And now I'm in the project home. Let's poke around a little bit here and see what we got. So you can see I have a source folder, a build.gradle, a README, and a license. All right, cool. I'm going to take a look at this. So I'm going to use Atom, which is just my text editor choice for simplicity. Make this a little bit bigger. So here is my folder structure. and I have my build Gradle file. This is the configuration for my build. So notice here that I can set my source and target compatibility to Java 1.8. So if you have a newer Java, this should probably take care of that for you. You have default tasks. So I have a clean and a jar. We also are going to use run, but you don't have to worry about that here. I also say, what is my main class? Like, what is the class? Like, if you think of this in like standard Java, context, this would be like the class with your main, right? That's exactly what it is. It's the class with my main. So we'll look at it in a moment, but I have a com FDFLib example black car service, which is my main in it. And then I have my dependencies. So here I'm referring to first, what are the repositories to check? Maven Central is important. That is where we're going to get our dependency from, which is 4DFLib, and possibly many others in the future, right, that you might actually get from the open source world. And here I'm saying what my dependencies are. So this one is good to have. This is a logging facade. It's called SLF4J. FDFLib does use it, so I believe you have to require it. I'm not sure that FDFLib will do that for you. And basically what it means is when you want to manipulate logging, you have a way to do it. Not going to dive too deep into that. You can play around with it. It's not honestly required for you to have an in-depth knowledge of this or any knowledge of it. You can use standard system out printlns for what you need. But if you wanted to debug within 4DFLib, you would want to have a pretty good grasp on what a logging facade is. So, if you were, say, taking option 2, you probably wouldn't even need it then necessarily. I know you could do option 2 on the project without this, but it would probably be to your benefit to have it. It's going to help you understand how to request different stuff from 4DFLib as far as logging goes, change the logging level and do all that. There's also logback, which is related. I'm not going to kind of go all the way into that. But the important one here is 4DFLib itself, which is version 1.3 here. That is a good working version for us to use. And this is how our project knows to pull that jar in when it needs it. So that's the build file. It's pretty straightforward. The README is just pretty much a mirror, I think. It's a little out of date probably of what's on the GitHub. I mean, that's what GitHub is using to render it, so it's obviously a mirror. And the license is just that this is open source. It's MIT, so you can basically do whatever the hell you want with it. The only requirement for MIT is attribution. That's it. So that's that. Let's poke around in the source where it matters. So resources here is just the logback file. This, by the way, is where you would go if you wanted to change the log level of, what 4DFLib's log level is. Right now it's sent to info. If you want it to be debug or something, you can do that here. But again, that's kind of a little bit of a digression, so I'm going to come back over here. And then in 4DFLib's code itself, we have a model package and a service package, and we have our black car service. Let's start there. So this is the black car service code. Here is that main. Remember we said this is the actual method that's going to be kicked off when you do a Gradle run. So we're pointing it here. First it's going to have this system out println. And then we're going to run this method called set optional settings. So this is important. This is where we configure 4DFLib to do its job. So the very first thing we do is 4DFLib itself, it's kind of like parent object of the settings, is a singleton. We don't need more than one, we just need one of this. So if you've never encountered a singleton before, I highly recommend you Google Java and singleton pattern, although you don't even need Java, it's just a singleton. Singleton pattern for any language is pretty much the same idea, but if you Google it for Java, you'll see the specifics of like how you set it up in Java. And the idea here is this is an object that you only ever intend to have one instance of. So since it's static in nature, I can get that instance by calling the class directly and saying get instance, and then I get the instance. And this is done because there's a private constructor and there's a whole lot of plumbing behind it. If you Google it, you'll see how that pans out. And if you're curious how this particular one is implemented, you can always go here in the source. I actually have a link to it here. Where is it? Logging, connection pool. Here it is, FDF settings. Let me make this a little bit bigger. And you can see here how that works. So you can see here that there's a static final instance, which is what we're actually using. And then there's also private constructors and a whole lot of plumbing around how this thing actually works. So you can, here it is down here, the private one, and there is a public one. The public one just returns the instance. So you can play more, and you can check out just singleton patterns in general if you're curious how that works. But again, the idea here is that there will only ever be one of this thing. Now, since I have this open, this is actually a really good opportunity to show you how there's a whole lot more in here as far as settings go. And there's also a lot of documentation here. So if you have questions about the settings and something's not working for you, come to this file and look at the documentation to do with that setting so you can get a feel for what's going on. There's obviously a lot here that has to do with Hikari. We're not going to be using Hikari. Hikari is a connection pool that's a really good one. It's lightweight, it's fast, which is good. There's other ones out there for in the Java world, like I think it's C3PO or something like that, like you would think the Droid. This one is a really good one, and it's also a dependency of 4DFLib, so 4DFLib can use it. By default, it is turned off. For what we are doing, we don't have to worry about connection pooling. Remember, we talked about what connection pooling is a little while ago, right? A couple weeks ago. But for what we're doing here, we don't need to use it. But the cool part about using libraries like this is if you want to turn it on, it's as simple as setting this setting to true, right? So once you do, then you can then override Hikari's own settings here. So you can change timeouts and things like that. But I don't want to digress too far into that. There's important information here about how to connect. So this is like HyperSQL connection settings. There's ones in here for just general connection settings and for Postgres and MySQL, etc. So let's look at that here. So I brought over to this file the ones that we need to think about. And they're already set up. So if you're using MySQL, and like I said before, you have a default root password of nothing, which is here, this is all ready to go. You don't actually have to change anything. I just want to give you a quick overview of what we're looking at. If you wanted to use Postgres, for example, I actually have the 2 lines you need here, and all you need to do is uncomment them. So you would take this out, you would take this out, and you would then comment MySQL, because you're not using MySQL, you're using Postgres. And just like that, if your database information, as far as your username and password were the same, which they wouldn't be, most likely, you would be done. But you would also then want to change the DB root user and password to match whatever the root password and user are for your Postgres database, not for your MySQL database. So I'm going to go ahead and put those back because I am using MySQL, but I wanted to show you that. And database encoding can, most likely stay the same. This is just setting the encoding for your database. You guys saw this when we, way back when, looked at create statements and we said, create table, blah, 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 character encoding UTF-8. That's what this is doing under the covers. It's just picking an encoding scheme. This is where you actually set the name of the database. So if I wanted to change this, in fact, why not? Let's just change it for the fun of it. You don't have to. I'm going to call this one class demo, and you'll see when it creates the database that in fact this will be the name of the database that it creates. Then I'm also going to set my host here, which is localhost. This just means that I am intending to use the database server on the same machine that I'm working on. If you had a database, say, on another machine, like a database server in your server farm, then you would put either the IP address or DNS of that server here. So for development, you're most likely going to be using localhost, and that is in fact the default. Some of these are defaults, but I put them in here just to kind of talk about them, but you don't actually need them. You could have ignored them since they're defaults, and they would be set that way anyway. Database information. So this isn't the root user, but as you've learned, right, we need the root user to create a database, or at least universally. It's possible maybe you have a user, depending on your relational database management system and how you've configured it, that is capable of doing that. That's not a root user. But from my library's perspective, I can only assume the root user is like the only user that has that ability. So just so you know, why this software is looking for your root user name and password is simply to create the database. If you don't want it to create the database, you can actually skip that step and create it yourself and ignore this piece. But I'm not going to suggest doing that, because any variables we inject into the situation lead to possible where things go awry. But just so you know, it is not required that your root username and password go in here. It's just required if you want it to create the database for you. It will also use that information to create the root information to create a user and password that will, from then on, will be the user and password it uses to interact with that database. So in this case, we're going to create a user called blackcar and a database password called blackcarpass. And I'm going to change this just because it's possible I've run it before on my computer, and I want to make sure that it actually does create a new piece of a new user there instead of just reusing an old one just for fun. And yours, if you don't add the demos, yours will just be blackcar, and that's fine. So now you can change these, by the way, if you want a more secure password, obviously. That's just what I have here for the demo. So this is now another thing I didn't really talk about with 4DFLib, but in addition to having the history piece, it's also multi-tenant by default. So remember that work you did in the last project to actually make your project multi-tenant, where you could have all these clients inside? Well, the cool part, I think it's cool, about 4DFLib is that it actually does that for you. Every single table gets a tenant ID, and that tenant ID can be used to have multiple tenants within the same database, and they can be as transparent or not as you want them to be from each other. So as part of that, you don't have to use that facility. You can set the default tenant's name. So in this case, it's Blackcar Core API. Central API service for the Blackcar application. By the way, this demo is intended to be an example of what a back-end service might look like using this setup. So it's meant to be like something that would eventually be built into an API service. It doesn't have a GUI or anything like that, mostly because it's an example and that stuff takes a lot of time. This is just meant to show how we interact with the database. And then we have the default name for the tenant, the description for the tenant. Sorry, I was looking at the system name earlier when I was describing the tenant. I meant to be down here. So the tenant information is here. The system is just a description of another kind of abstraction it gives you, which is the system. I'm not going to worry about that. You can just, again, there's defaults, but if you want to override them and actually name them for your system, we're not going to be using multiple ones, so we're not going to go down that path. This is the tenant one that I was talking about before. Default tenant is primary, kind of redundant, but sure, it's true. I don't remember what I was thinking when I did that one. And you can actually add a tenant website. Now, you can set another tenant to be primary, I know. So I guess it's just because we're calling it default that it seems a little redundant. But at any rate, those are the settings. So it's going to run these when we're here, and it's going to set 4DFLib up to connect to the database. Now, 4DFLib itself, as soon as it connects, is going to look for a data model, and it's going to do this. It's going to initialize your data model. So what does that mean? That means that as you create model classes, the way 4DFLib works is you can create as many classes as you want, but unless they are added to the model here, 4DFLib will not manage them in the database. Now, you might do this on purpose because you might create an entire data model that has nothing to do with what you want in your database, right? And that's great. You can do that, absolutely. And you can still use it in your programming, and you can manage that yourself. And 4DFLib won't care. But if you have classes that you're like, well, I want there to be a database table for these classes, then you just simply take the class and add it, and that's it. So This syntax, by the way, is what we're doing here is we're referring to the actual class here. So you're saying driver.class. And if you put any object there and you start typing, you'll see that you have that ability there. I'm not using a more robust IDE here for this demo like IntelliJ, but I do recommend one, especially for your project if you're going to be working in here for a long time. I might actually kick out of this in a little bit and fire up IntelliJ just so you can see it there. But you'll get much more code look ahead and all those kinds of features there. And once you've added all the classes, there's only going to be 2 that we care about here, and you can see them here. Notice the car make I don't add because, as you'll see in a moment, this is quite literally just an enumeration, so it's not something I wanted to store in the database, but a car and a driver are. So that's important. So once you do that, you add them to this array. So here, or I should say class, or list of classes, excuse me. And then you add your list, you pass your list into the initialized data model, and that's when it creates the database and manages the whole thing. Now, I'm also going to, once I create the data, I wanted to insert some demo data. So I have another function here called insert some data. Let's go down there. Here it is. And let's take a look at what's happening here. So the first thing I do is I initialize a service. So for both my car service and my driver service, I'm creating an instance of that service. And I'm going to pause here just to kind of look at the structure of this. So within my package structure here, I have models and I have services. The data model we saw, let's take another look there. So this is a car. It has attributes like make, model, and year. And it also has things like color, name, description, etc. It has a FDF ignore annotation. So hopefully you guys have seen annotations in your experience as programmers, but if not, this is something that the pre-compiler deals with. It kind of looks at this and it reacts to it, and you can set up annotations to do all kinds of stuff. FDFLib has some annotations that it uses. One of them is to ignore certain things. So if I don't want a particular thing to go into the database, I ignore it. Now, why would I have done this here? The answer is here, because I intend my database to use this as a foreign key to the driver ID, but I also want in my object-oriented programming world to have the concept of a driver class. So by ignoring the driver object or class, 4DFLib is not going to try to take this complex data object and save it. And by the way, it can do things like that with complex objects. It does them in, I can't remember honestly if it uses blobs or whatever it does, but it does have a facility to deal with stuff like that, but I don't want to do that. So I'm actually going to ignore this object because what I really want the database to do is keep this ID. But when I create a car from the database, like when I pull it back out, I want the ability to create this current driver based on what I get out of this current driver ID, right? So once I get the actual car, I can see, okay, current driver ID is 5. I can query the driver table to get that driver, and I can populate this guy and let's look at that. Let's look at the driver class by going here and creating one of these. So you can see here that there's just 3 attributes here. It's much more simple. So a driver has a first name, last name, and phone number. Notice here that I also have a constructor with this call to super. So what's happening there is notice that driver and also car extend common state.